Hello everyone, my name is Illarionov and this is...
And I'm Viktor Mukha. So we work at Paradoxcat. These are some of our partners and references. And you may have heard about Paradoxcat before. We also presented something on this meetup about integration of Ramsys 3D engine with Android. But today it's about AOSP. So we worked with BMW on their Android Automotive OS for a while. And so we have some collected some knowledge in both Android apps, but also customization on the platform.
So we gave this talk on DroidCon Berlin, as was mentioned before, so we will skip some parts because they're not so interesting to you guys. So we would rather focus on working with Visual Studio Code today, like local and remote workflow. We will take a glance at Android Studio for platform, and if time left, provide some additional tips and tricks on AOSP. Today the problem is there is no standard AOSP development environment established. So everyone is just working on their own. So all the practice tips and tricks are staying inside, not going to public. And we would like to change that. We want to start a long-going conversation about sharing their experiences, starting with us. So yes, we assume you already know how to fetch and build AOSP. So we will not focus here on that. And you know all the requirements, obviously. So yes, there are many tools to work on AOSP, but today we will focus rather on Visual Studio Code with live demos and take a glance on Android Studio for platform after that. So let's jump straight away into VS Code. If Zoom is okay, then say nothing. And this is the default interface with well, recent sessions which are tied to our working directories. It remembers small and restores most of the stuff. It's pretty handy. But right now, let me just open our prepared build. So we will not wait for 5 hours. Yeah. And when you open such a big project, you might run into issue with the file watcher going in background. So to mitigate that, you can exclude .repo and out directories and increase max user watches, and it should be fine. So it has a built-in terminal with the help of which I can just reverse search and prepare my build environment. I will launch Cuttlefish Auto here and launch the emulator. So what do we want to showcase? Like let's change something in global configuration file and pick some very simple and visual parameter, and I have a perfect candidate for that, a toast, and we will change toast default gravity. So here I'm using built-in search functionality with match case, match whole word, and regex, so you don't need to grab. And I will filter by XML files and go to the first one, hopefully. Yeah, it is frameworks base. So this is base file. And the default value is center horizontal bottom here. So the emulator should be running by now. We can connect to the Cuttlefish via localhost 8443 via WebRTC. And sometimes you just need to click home to make it show. Yeah, now it's great. And to see how the toast looks by default, please give me some FPS here. I don't know why it lags so hard sometimes, But yes, to check how toast looks by default, what is going on here? Is it?
By the way, if anybody knows why sometimes
God.
cuttlefish device would be super slow, we would be happy to know and to learn about it.
Yeah, would be nice. Now it even showed me the previous frame. What was that? But okay, back to the business. Yes, here we trying to become an Android developer in AOSP, and you can see how default toast looks like. Now let's change that, but not here, because in base file it's a bad idea. We will need to wait a lot of time to get it rebuilt, and it's just better to change it in your device you're working with. So from here, I will go, we are working with cuttlefish right now. So I go to device, Google, cuttlefish, and I will change it in shared overlays. Yeah, overlays, core, res, values, config. Exactly. So I get this value and just paste it here, and we'll update it to 79, which, just believe me, will be fill center. I save that. I cancel the previous emulator with Ctrl+C, and I can build, which will be 10 seconds. About that, not 5 hours. Here we have a built-in source control functionality with all you need: state change, revert, next, previous change. Now it's built already. I told you 10 seconds. I can launch the emulator. And also for source control, we have it here with all the auto-recognized Git repositories inside our folder, but the change is just in cuttlefish, which we did right now. So we can click on that, and this, while it's zoomed in, it does not show the two windows which I just knew today. Yeah, that's pretty interesting, you know. And yeah, you have via extensions, you can install a Git graph extension, which is quite useful. It adds this little button here, so you can check the Git history. And here we don't have much of it, because when I did a repo sync, yes, of course, repo sync, I used depth1 parameter. So it helps to save time and space if you don't really care about Git history or here, right? Now our emulator is up and running, and we can update it by retriggering this switch, and we can go and check if the change was successful. Now it's better now, yes? And yes, it was. You can see the difference from the previous time. And this is how we can work on AOSP in Visual Studio Code locally on this very laptop, which we're translating right now from. And Viktor will now tell you about the remote workflow.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roman. Let me go back to VS Code. Hope it's large enough. And let us close this folder so we have a clean VS Code again. So obviously you can pull out the terminal in VS Code and go to your remote machine, which I have configured to be called AOSP. And boom, we can see the build host has changed. So the host name is now different. And indeed, we have more processing units. Nice. But, well, it doesn't solve any problem, right? So you can just pull out Ubuntu terminal and do the same. How do you actually integrate with the VS Code so that you can open files and navigate just as we did it locally? For that, VS Code team has developed a series of remote plugins. The one we'll be using today is called Remote SSH. And once you install it, you get such an icon, Remote Explorer, and it picks up your SSH configuration. So you can connect to your remote machine. You can also do it from here, the lower left corner, connect to host, or just Ctrl+Shift+P, type connect, and remote SSH connect to host. Let's use this button, connect in current window. So now if we pull out the terminal, again, we see we're already on this machine. Great. So what is the difference? The difference is actually only here on the bottom left, saying SSH AOSP. Visually, you wouldn't see any other differences, which is kind of a good thing because we want to emulate the local workflow, right? So how does it actually work? So locally, we have VS Code client. This is this app installed on our machine. Remotely, VS Code copies its own headless server on the very first SSH connection. So when you do the SSH via this remote plugin, it basically SCPs. No, it first tries to get it from the internet, and then if it can't, it would SCP from the local host to the server. And once it's there, they communicate to one another. That means that you get a much quicker response locally. So it's a much nicer experience for a developer. So once we have that, let's have another exercise. We will change boot animation now in our cuttlefish device, but on a remote server. So first, we would like to see the vanilla boot animation. For that, let's do source. Okay, we're not in the right directory, right? So we have to go into the AOSP. Same pre-built cuttlefish, Android 14. Okay, so we open that, and now we see the same thing as locally, right? So let's prepare it, source, launch. And before I start the emulator, we have to think, okay, well, it's running on a remote server. Will it actually work if we just pull out like localhost and this port? Well, VS Code is smart enough to forward the port which has been opened and it can detect it. But as you would learn if you try, Cuttlefish WebRTC streaming needs more ports to be open, many more ports. So how do we do that? We can go here to ports and click add port and keep doing that until we're bored. Or we could go to SSH configuration file. And I have already done this exercise. I did use script, I didn't do it manually. We save that, close. And now in order to actually have these ports open, we need to close the remote connection and SSH again, which is sort of logical. We can do that by just clicking on the recent sessions. This is what I usually use most often, so that it reopens the same directory. Okay, so now we can do source, launch, and start the emulator. So what's so you see it's detecting the port, opening it, and it should just work. What's also an interesting tool we're using is called screen. So right now we have started process in this terminal, right? And it's running there. But if we, for some reason, disconnect or we close or our battery on the laptop dies, this process is orphaned, so we can't get back to it. So in order for that to not happen, we usually use a tool called screen. So we can start a new session and say, we call it boot animation. And then it opens a session and we can ls list the sessions and we see boot animation is attached currently. So let's see if the emulator actually started. So we want to see the vanilla boot animation. This is it. So this is what you get from Google. Probably a lot of you are familiar with it. So now we want to change it, right? We can close that and close the whole terminal session. How do we change it? Well, we have prepared our boot animation zip file. If you want to learn how to do that, Google. It's not that complicated, so we'll skip that today. For that, we would like to go to the cuttlefish device, let's say 64-bit only automotive. And I have prepared a little change here to copy the zip file into system partition. Now the question is, how do we get this zip file, which is local to my machine, into the server? Right, so usually you would use something like rsync or ASfP or some GUI tool based on these. What you can do with VS Code is pretty cool. You can just drag and drop it into the folder you would like to. So I'm assuming it does ASCP because we are connected via SSH, so it kind of would be logical. So once it's copied, it tries to open it. Obviously, it's a zip file, so it's there. Right now, we can basically, so we can check if we're still in the same screen session. Yes, we are touched, so we can just do source launch and start building this thing. So what I use for building is, you might have seen a couple of additional parameters. So this is for push notifications. At some point I discovered, well, sometimes you would start the build and wait. You would think, okay, this should take roughly like 2 hours, maybe 4 hours. And you go somewhere else, do other things, and you come back after 4 hours just to realize you forgot a comma and it actually failed after 20 seconds. So to avoid that, I always use push notifications for larger tasks. And you can also add something like this into your bash RC, like alias things, or also wrap commands so that you always get push notification. It's quite handy. So it's still building, and we don't have that much time, so I'll just show you the result. This is what we would get if we started it with a new boot animation file. And here we are, Paradoxcat logo. That's what you see. Cool, huh? Let's get back to slides. Quickly, local versus remote. So there is no silver bullet. Each side has its pros and cons. So remote server is usually faster. So we have 48 cores, 64 gigabytes virtual machines on the server. These take around an hour to build. You can get much faster. But locally, there's usually 5+ hours if you are building on a typical laptop. When using remote extensions, you can also install VS Code client on Mac, on Windows, on Linux, it doesn't matter, everything's supported. And it doesn't also load your client, right? So if you're building locally, we have experienced that a lot of times, that if you build locally on your own laptop, it's Ubuntu, and then OS really struggles, and at some point you wouldn't be even able to browse the web.
Oh yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, so we have also an option of kind of local but dedicated machine. I would say just remote to it, because you don't want to use 2 different set of keyboards, 2 different displays and window managers. So either use VNC or VLC, VNC, yeah, or VS Code remote. But local option is also good sometimes if you want the emulator, it runs out of the box. We have just seen on remote you need some network configuration, and sometimes maybe a problem with IT. You can download directly from browser. Oh yeah, I got a notification that the build was successful. Very well. And you can also connect USB stuff directly to a laptop if you're working locally, and you can flash your hardware, right? So with a remote setup, it's a little more complicated. You need to use something like USB over IP. Also, when you're using remote and you're constantly on SSH connection, obviously you need the connection to be working. There's not much you can do without it. Yeah, so let's, I think we still have some minutes. Let's spend some time on ASfP.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, plenty of time.
All right. So recently we've got a new solution from Google, Android Studio for Platform, which has a lot of built-in functionality from the normal Android Studio IDE. To start working with that, you can just import your AOSP project as ASfP project, like providing all the parameters you would do via terminal. Also, you can enable or disable C++ support, but be careful which module you include here, because the more you include, the more it will index. But a little bit on that a little bit later. So all the settings comes here in ASfP config.json, where you can play around with them later, change it anytime. And in the recent Canary version, they also added environment vars and build flags, so you don't need to overwrite it elsewhere anymore. And yes, it just looks and feels like a normal Android Studio with autocomplete, debugging, testing, and navigating. It really feels like home for normal Android developer. But there is almost no documentation right now. We have one how to install page with 1 8-minute long video on how to use that, which for me was not quite enough. We have a Google groups where you can ask questions and they really answer. That's cool. As I mentioned before, indexing takes extra time. So the more the project is, the more it will index the first time you open it. And yeah, if you're using the same projects, I would say limited amount of projects you have on your hands, then it might be worth it. But what we did today, for example, with those quick changes, it would take more time to just index than we did it with Visual Studio Code right now. And on roadmap, there is a design editor for XML and Compose, and remote work support, but we don't know when it will be done. Yeah, that's it. Now, if we have any more time, back to Viktor.
I think we do a little bit. Let me quickly glance over these. Some additional tips and tricks. So consistent build environment, think Docker or virtual machine configuration. That basically saves you from some random build failures just because you forgot to install some of the packages via sudo apt install. Another tip, quite useful one, you can forward your ADB from remote. So if on a remote server you start an emulator, you can forward its ADB port, and then you can connect to the emulator via screen copy. It works really well, much better than X11 forwarding or something like that. Or you can connect directly from your local Android Studio and just push apps there. So I started to talk a little bit about flashing. So for that, you would need something like USB over IP. When connecting the hardware directly to the server is really not an option. Like for us, it's in a server room. We don't even have the access. So you can connect the hardware to a client, like my Windows laptop, and forward USB directly to the server, and then it would flash it directly. That works. It's an extra hoop you have to touch every time you connect the device. But yeah, feel free to explore it. There are more useful VS Code extensions. So for AIDL, for logcat files. So what I like to do with logcat, actually not to open it in the terminal, but rather transfer it to a file from the terminal and then open the file and color it with this extension. And then I can navigate in the file and copy from it. It's much nicer than working in the terminal. And it's also saved. And you have also Makefiles extension. For VS Code, there is a cheat sheet for every platform. Print it out, put it next to your laptop. It's really helpful. To summarize the whole talk, AOSP is huge, so we need good tools to work with that. We have looked at VS Code. It gives you really consistent workflow to work locally or on remote as you wish. So if you don't really need all of this Android Studio functionality, this is definitely choice number one. ASfP gives you more. If you're used to Android Studio, it's also helpful, but it costs you indexing time for every module you would like to include. And for now, it's also local only, so you can install it directly on the server and then use window management from the server, like via VNC or X forwarding. But it's definitely not as nice as VS Code remote plugins. Also, don't forget to use push notifications to notify yourself. It's really cool. And yes, it's okay to use other tools. We see you in the crowd. We don't see you, but we imagine that you VI and Emacs users are out there and you're still loving them and you're using Tmux and you're really happy with that. Do so, but also share it with us so that we know. With that, please tell us about your experiences, your tool chain. These are our email addresses. Drop us a message there or on LinkedIn. Thank you so much. And any questions?
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, there are a few questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see that your end.
We have only one screen, so we would have to alt.
Okay. Well, let me read them out so that they will be recorded as well. Let me scroll up to the top.
Maybe we just stop sharing and then it's easier.
Okay, yeah.
Stop sharing.
If you would want to,
that's fine.
Show some slides. I don't know.
Okay, so question. I think there are some answers already in the chat, but Andre asks, how do you import ASP code into VS Code? Do you just open the main ASP folder, or is there some special indexing thing like you have to do with Android Studio?
Yeah, so it's an interesting point. So if you're just using one specific device target, you would definitely just open the folder and you're working in one ASP3. What I sometimes do, I open my whole home folder in the VS Code with a disabled file watcher. And it doesn't try to index anything. It doesn't try to process it, but I have access to several source trees at the same time. So it's helpful if you just want to search for something, but you don't really know which device it was. And if you have multiple ASP trees, you can totally do that. But no special config files, it's just opening the folder.
Okay. So does that mean that it doesn't index everything in the way that Android Studio does? Because that takes like about 6 hours.
You have to be careful with extensions you install.
Right.
So once you install C++ and Java extensions, your VS Code will silently do so much stuff that my server was running for 2 weeks and didn't finish. So, and it was a server which has built ASP 13 in 30 minutes. So don't do that. Bad idea. But you can specify specific modules to index.
Okay.
Just in ASfP, and then totally doable.
Okay, cool. Let's get well. Somebody asked a question about how much memory and disk do you need, but I think the question was really relating to how much memory and disk do you need to build AOSP rather than to run VS Code. I assume VS Code is much more lightweight than, say, Android Studio, which requires as much memory as ASP does.
Yeah, VS Code, you can run it on a tablet.
Yeah, good. Somebody asks, Victor, how much time does it take to build a simple change like the one you showed? So I think that actually finished while you were talking.
Yeah, it took
3
roughly
minutes?
3 minutes,
3 minutes,
I believe. Yeah.
almost exactly.
Yeah. That sounds believable. So incremental builds are generally quite quick, as long as you
Yeah.
have a decent machine. And that was building on your server 48 core machine, wasn't it?
It was on the server, but it really didn't matter much. I think it was simply repackaging the system image. Actually, there is an argument to M to make command.
Mhm.
You can give so that it doesn't build the images. So if you just want to build one single module, for example, and
Right,
then
yep.
you push it, and then you work in that manner, you can
Yep.
even cut the cost of rebuilding the images all over again.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, so typically I use MM or MMM if I just want to test if this thing compiles.
Yeah.
And that can speed things up a lot. So Andre says, which version of ASfP do you run? I think there is only one version as far as I know.
Personally, I tried both the stable and canary. Yeah, and the canary they do not update it frequently. That's true. Yeah, the latest canary was like, I don't know, 2 months, maybe more ago.
How's the canary distributed? Is it like a mailing list, zip archive, or something like that?
Oh, they just posted the link in the Google groups, and I downloaded from there. But you can install and have it separately in parallel.
Okay, cool. There's a lot of questions here. This is good. So Javed, apologize if I mispronounced that, asks, what is the state of AOSP building on a Mac with non-Intel chipsets? I think we can say there is no state. It does not exist.
Yeah.
I would love to learn if anybody tried.
That's a good way.
I would assume it would.
It's never going to work.
It would just use the Rosetta virtualization thing. And
well, okay, okay, I'm not so familiar. It certainly will not be able to build using ARM in ARM mode because all of the binaries are compiled for x86, all the pre-builts and whatever.
The pre-builts. Exactly.
So if it does work, it's going to work quite slowly in emulation mode. Basically, don't try it. It's not worth the effort. buy a decent Intel machine. Sorry, that's the answer.
Another option is exactly what Roman did, which was VS Code on remote. So use Mac as a thin client.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you can even use Windows in this case. God, yes. Wow.
even your phone, basically.
Even your phone.
There is actually a VS Code app for like iPad, and it can connect to VS Code server part.
Okay.
So I don't know if it would work like by SSH, but if you have a VS Code server like on your own server, like GitHub pages, they do that. Then
it's called Coder.
Coder. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. Okay, I'm going to have to put an end to this in a moment or two, but there's some interesting questions here. So Pierre Fisher asks, you were talking about VS Code for coding ASP. Have you ever thought of using VS Code for coding apps? Would it be of any benefit there? The main benefit is you wouldn't have to use Android Studio.
Yes, it's a huge one, actually, not to underestimate. I believe I've heard some people did that for whatever reason, but it's hard.
I mean, it's probably better than using VI or Emacs, probably.
In the end, you would just basically have some auto completion, yes, and you would run commands like grade build Gradle stuff from the built-in terminal. But yeah, not very nice experience, I would believe.
No, indeed, I would totally agree. So if you're doing that work, probably best to stick with Android Studio. James John Gatt says, okay, comment, if you want to make a flashable zip, it's MOTA package. Okay. Is it possible to get auto completion in VS Code?
Yeah, that's what I
Benny
discussed.
says that. I think you've covered that. Kartik Reddy says, I do wonder why ASP builds lots of files just for a small change. It would be, I want to know why for every change it builds lots of files. Well, I think we'd all like to know that, to be honest. The Android build system is bizarre in the extreme. It's a very good example of how not to create a build system. I could talk a lot more about that, but on the other hand, it is what it is. It does what it does. There's no alternative, so you've got to get used to it. Multi-user work question. What is that? Hang on a second, I'll be with you. I'm just scrolling back to, looks like I skipped over a question. Oh, yes. So Ishmael says, how does the multi-user work on the server? Okay, how do you work multi-user on the server, I think? The ASP folder is shared. Do you use the same user?
Yeah, we had experience with having different Ubuntu users, basically, on a single server. That worked really badly. So once you have more than one ASP build running at the same time, everything goes to hell. It's just super slow. And then what I would do instead, if you have to share, just separate it either, I don't know, probably with virtual machines. That's the best.
But you're not, you wouldn't expect multiple developers to be hacking on the same source code base?
We didn't do that.
I can't imagine that would work very well.
That could work.
Okay.
I remember Visual Studio, was it Visual Studio or VS Code, who were also presenting these remote taking over features, like you can actually start VS Code on one side with all of these configurations and plugins and whatnot, and then you start on the other side and give over the control so that somebody else has it, like for reviews, code reviews and stuff like that. But I'm not sure if it's still there.
Okay, so I think probably the answer to that is it probably isn't a good idea. Okay, I have one question of my own. Okay, yeah, so you were using SSH to connect to, are you using SSH to connect to your local server? Well, your in-house server, is that right?
Yes.
Do you use cloud servers at all for any of your work?
We didn't. That's the short answer. So we have considered and we are still considering, but it's probably not very cost effective for now.
I would tend to agree unless you're a rich corporation. Yeah. Okay, cool. Excellent. Right. I think that's covered everything. So unless anybody has anything to jump in at, no, I'm going to go there. So thank you very much, Roman and Victor. That was really, really good. And it's great to be a little bit more interactive than we were at DroidCon, where it was a big audience and a big room. So it's nice to have a slightly more intimate feel to it.
Yeah, that was nice. I have so many questions. Thank you, guys.
So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.